Hi, I'm Diane Gregg, and welcome to Invisible Women, a podcast about 8 women who worked in espionage during World War II. They were from different countries, cultures, and backgrounds. What they had in common was the opportunity to step outside of societal norms, while at the same time working in the shadows. And while their contributions were incredibly important, they've been hidden. Invisible Women is an opportunity to hear their stories, to explore their roles in society, and to discover what we can learn from their stories that's relevant today.
I remember making my way on foot several times, couriering messages between my father and the other cell members in Nowy Bytom. The Volksdeutsch came to know me as I was often out couriering, and it was while doing this that I was shot at by some of them.
That's Zosia, a young woman who began couriering for a resistance cell just prior to the invasion of Poland in September 1939. In 2005, when I asked Zosia what she'd like to say to young women today, she stated, "It's important to do what you know is right and not what others tell you to do." Although this sounds simple, she was speaking about the power of integrity and character, acting congruent with one's inner felt sense of what is right, and not being influenced by the dominant culture. Taking action from an inner locus of control is both grounding and meaningful. As discussed in the last episode, very early people's interpretation of the universal spirit as being personified as female made sense. It brought an embodied meaningfulness, interconnectedness, and continuity into their daily lives with what would be otherwise an abstract sense of divinity. Their relationships with the world had integrity, a felt sense of oneness as they move forward spiritually and daily in a grounded, harmonious way with the land, the animals, and the seasons. However, during waves of invasions from the northern European tribes between 3500 and 500 BCE, linear thinking and a cultural authoritarian stance developed. The power gradient favored dominance and control over nature and all sentient beings, and the severing of our connectedness to nature and ourselves began. Important aspects of the early spirituality, such as cyclic regeneration and other aspects associated with the feminine energy, such as the mystery rites of birth, death, and sex, and their teachings were lost as they became associated with darkness and evil. Although some symbols were assimilated into the ruling societies, important ways of being were no longer honored, like embodied wisdom and imaginal metaphoric thinking. At the same time as the building of Chartres and other Notre Dame cathedrals in Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries, there was a resurgence of the feminine energies within Christianity. As the Crusaders were returning from Egypt with the small black statues of Isis with Horus on her knee, there was a renewal of the Madonna, one that looked like the Virgin Mary, but carried the embodied, regenerative, and earthy aspects of the pagan archetype. This feminine energy was resurrected in the hearts and minds of the average person. Worship of the Dark Madonna unfolded through the European countryside as she was enshrined as the Black Virgin, a fertility goddess. These black statues pulled on the imagination and the societal missing pieces of the greater archetype, our deep connection to the earth, mysteries of life, and the unsentimental aspects of embodied knowing. By the way, the terms feminine and masculine are ways to personify archetypal energies that flow through us. They do not refer to women and men per se. We all carry these energies. It is just as important for men to connect with a collective energy banished to shadow as it is women. In addition, I'm not certain where the black and white descriptions for the Madonnas originated. However, archaeological digs have discovered that the great goddess figurines dating from 30,000 years ago were made of terracotta clay. In addition, the Isis statues brought back by the Crusaders were black, like the fertile soil of the Nile River. The associations in both cases were with the earth and the early people's relationship to it. Also, as you know, the color black holds all the colors of the spectrum, while white does not. Perhaps the question should be, why is the Virgin Mary seemingly drained of color? As per the last episode of Invisible Women, after walking the labyrinth at Chartres and taking stock of the large white marble statue of the Virgin Mary at the main altar and the small presentation of the Black Madonna in a cream-colored floral dress off to one side, I descended into Chartres' large crypt to view its ancient well and architecture. Walking the stone steps and viewing the massive foundation, the crypt was impressive. And then, at the end of a hallway, it opened up into a large stone room. It was both surprising and comforting to discover a small underground chapel with its rows of wooden chairs. A simple podium stood at the front, and beyond it, a small black seated Madonna, not behind a glass and not dressed up like a doll. While most tourists visited the elaborately carved marble Virgin Mary in the cathedral above, the townspeople came into the crypt during their lunch hour to pray to this Madonna. In the lackluster underground of plain stone walls and floor, it was mesmerizing to witness people pray in this windowless crypt of this grand cathedral. This very old, battered Black Madonna held deeper meaning. She was the real Our Lady of the Cathedral. This dark and quite ethereal archetype was worshipped in an underground way and associated with the soil, fertility, blessing of the crops, wisdom of the body, pregnancy, childbirth, lovemaking, and life's mysteries. She symbolized the epitome of all cultural spiritualities. She represented spirit in matter. In that moment, standing in the crypt's stone chapel, I realized like a dream I was witnessing the split of the great feminine archetype in the very stone of the cathedral and in the conscious and unconscious minds of Western culture. Instead of being enshrined whole as she was in the Newgrange Monument in Ireland 4,400 years earlier, here she was literally split. Above, the Virgin Mary, hailed by the establishment as the feminine face of Christianity, representing a pure but very narrow embodiment of the feminine energy. And below, literally in the underground, a small battered wooden Black Madonna statue symbolizing the once powerful attributes that had been repressed by the external culture and fallen into the unconscious for the most part. That internal locus of power, that connectiveness, felt sense, mystery, and the knowing of how to be in the world authentically was present, albeit couched in the cold, dark crypt of Christianity. Today, there are over 450 Black Madonnas in cathedrals, churches, and roadside shrines across Europe. Although there are none that I'm aware of in North America, the dark feminine archetypal energy is worshipped in other ways, but I'll leave that for another time. The Black Madonna has been especially venerated in Poland since at least the 13th century. She is an icon that defines Poland. Men wear her image on their lapels, and there are 5 celebrations to the Black Madonna of Częstochowa per year. In World War II and during the German occupation, pilgrimages to Jasna Góra, home of the Black Madonna painting, continued. This act of defiance is part of her teachings. Do what is right, be strong and stoic, and follow what is right action, even if it means breaking the rules. Become who you are meant to be, as your power is in character and integrity and not in dominance and control. As a testament to her power, Lech Walęsa's Nobel Peace Prize resides at the monastery in Jasna Góra. When you hear Zosia's story today, you will hear the courage and fortitude of a young Polish woman and how she gains strength from an icon who encompasses deep-rooted meaning for all Polish people. The Black Madonna bridges both Madonnas of Christianity, bringing her closer to the fuller, empowering force of the great feminine archetype. She brings wholeness and healing to the Polish people. Not only is the Black Madonna a testament to our dynamic engagement with the energetic patterns that flow through our lives, but she is a living symbol of how to survive and heal through catastrophic ordeals. And in her independence, she is a symbol for the emancipation of women. Now I'd like to share with you Zosia's story. In the late summer of 2004, I arrived at Zosia's home in the early afternoon. On the veranda, a welcoming planter of red geraniums overflowed at the front door. Zosia answered almost immediately and invited me to follow her to the back of the house, to her garden. She was 79 at the time, petite, with soft blonde hair and a disarming accent. And her home was immaculate, and paintings and photos of the family and a favorite cat graced the walls. We sat overlooking her garden. I absorbed the spaciousness and complete privacy of the backyard, with its white-barked birch trees, rose bushes, and many songbirds. She served us tea and apple pie. I knew from our telephone conversation that she was ill, and although a little tired, she wanted to tell me her World War II story. So we began.
You know, there is not enough time left for me to tell my story completely. I was 12 when my courier training began with the Girl Guides. We were told to sew a pocket into our underwear to carry messages and given instruction in signaling and air raid drills. We were to be prepared for any emergency and to think for ourselves. A couple of years before the invasion, the Girl Guides began to seriously teach war-related skills. This was especially important in Poland because we expected to be invaded again at any time. We were taught about the threat of war and the importance of resistance work. Also, I knew about war and résistance from my father, who was part of the underground in World War I. He was imprisoned for a while. He had prison tattoos up and down his arms. In World War II, he was the resistance cell leader. However, since he was a partisan prior to World War II and known to the Germans as a rebel, even before the declaration of war and the invasion, German soldiers were infiltrating the western areas of Poland, and some arrived at our house demanding to know where he was. The first time it happened, we saw them coming, and he escaped out through the attic and across the rooftop. I answered the door. There were 2 soldiers. I was terrified because our closets were used as resistance cell ammunition caches with guns and explosives. They did not search the house, as they had no ideas that we were already that far along. They just wanted to pick him up because he was on their blacklist. There were many Germans where we lived, as the western area of Poland had once belonged to Germany. The Germans in our area were called the Volksdeutsche. They really wanted to be part of Germany again. It was August 1939, a few days before the German invasion of Poland actually began. We knew it was coming from radio reports and from friends and neighbors. We all bought as much food as we could. Then, families were told to leave our small town in Silesia. It was close to the German border and known for its rich mineral and natural resources, so we knew they'd be coming in force. But the resistance members and my father were staying behind so that he and Polish soldiers could lay explosives to blow up bridges leading into the town and the coal mine facilities. My father asked me to stay to courier messages between them. My mother, brothers, and sisters left to go to my aunt's further east. I was 15 at the time, the youngest daughter. I felt honored to stay and help him. Prior to the German invasion, the town, Czarny Las, was in chaos. There was considerable discomfort and fighting already existing between the Germans and Poles who occupied the area. And by the time the invasion neared, there were many Silesians who were fanatical Nazi supporters, the Volksdeutsche. I remember making my way on foot several times, couriering messages between my father and the other cell members in Nowy Bytom. The Volksdeutsch came to know me as I was often out couriering, and it was while doing this that I was shot at by some of them. They were waiting for the German army to start the invasion and were hoping to kill as many Poles as they could before they were liberated by their army. They knew I was Polish, and that was enough for them to shoot at me. They always missed. While we were in Czarny Las, the news came that the German army was advancing rapidly and would soon be in the town. They were expected to send their first troops underground from the German coal mines just across the border, blasting their way through into the Polish coal mines. The resistance, when they heard this, were going to blow up the Polish mines to prevent them. However, they knew they would destroy many Polish homes, so they didn't. Soon after these neighborhood shootings, the Germans invaded Poland. There were no trains leaving our town, so we left everything behind. My father and I left Czarny Las to join the rest of the family in Nowy Bytom. We could hear the gunfire of the approaching German army as we left. We ran, walked along the road, staying close to the tree line when possible. In Nowy Bytom, both my aunt's family and the rest of my family were going to board evacuation trains moving towards the east. We were in open cattle cars, and after a few days of moving very slowly, and with several strafing attacks on us by Luftwaffe, we left the train along with many others. Later, we heard that half of the train was blown up. It was thought that the Volksdeutsche were among us and had somehow been helping the Luftwaffe in their attacks on the train. We walked for many days away from what we now knew was the advancing German army. We lived for several weeks by sleeping in ditches, sometimes in barns, eating whatever we could find in the fields: cabbage, carrots, tomatoes. Some farmers gave us a meal. One evening, we saw a deserted schoolhouse, and we stopped there to rest for the night. My mother and we children stayed in the school while my father went across the field to sleep in a barn with the other men. However, my mother had a premonition that something was wrong. She sent me across the field barefoot to the barn where my father was. She believed that he was among German spies. I was slowly walking across the freshly harvested cornfield in bare feet, watching where I walked. All of a sudden, I was caught in a crossfire. Some Polish men were shooting it out with German spies who'd been among us. I had to run and keep running into the ditch along the field to avoid the bullets. But after a few jumps, I decided to rush on ahead so that I could reach my father quickly. I found my father and when the skirmish was over, the Germans retreated into the woods. My feet were bleeding badly from the stubble of the cornstalks. He took me back to the schoolhouse to have my feet bandaged. My family and relatives left the area before sunrise. Later that day, we heard that the schoolhouse was blown up that night. My mother had a sixth sense about things. All her life, as did one of my sisters. I trusted my instincts, but I can't say I had premonitions. We continued east and soon joined the other refugees moving along the road. At one point, and very fortunately, a farmer offered us shelter in his barn in return for farm work. We were there for a couple of weeks, and then the farmer heard on his radio that the Germans were nearing the town where we were. My father had to leave us to go into hiding before the German army arrived. We already knew his name was on the Germans' blacklist and he would be shot if captured. When the German army arrived, everyone and everywhere was searched. When they found nothing, the soldiers became very angry and threatening. They even ordered me to remove all insignia from my already ripped Girl Guide uniform. Maybe they thought a 15-year-old girl in a uniform might start a guerrilla movement behind their lines. They always tried to humiliate us. Since the Russians were approaching from the opposite direction, my mother decided that it would be better to return home and face what was left for us in German-occupied territory, as the Russians were more ruthless than the Germans. The Russian soldiers had a license to do whatever they wanted, and they were known for wanting wine and women. And since my father could not be with us, it was good to leave. We did not know when he would return. Once the bulk of the German army moved through the area, my mother sent my older brother, my sister, and me to return home to check to see if it was safe enough for the rest of the family to return. The three of us found our way home by a combination of bus, train, streetcar, walking and accepting rides from farmers. We continued to eat what we could dig up in farmers' fields. So, the house was intact. So the first thing Mother had told us to do was to locate all the pistols, rifles, and ammunition hidden by my father and throw them into the outhouse pit behind the house. It was a close call, because the very next day the German soldiers arrived and at gunpoint asked us if they had weapons or ammunition and where our father was. We said we didn't have any arms and did not know where he was. This time, they searched the house and luckily found nothing. My brother set out to collect my mother and the other 4 siblings. My sister and I got the house ready before Mother returned. When my mother returned, life resumed, but it was not normal. It was much worse, especially since my father remained in hiding and my oldest brother had left to join the Polish cavalry, and we weren't sure what had happened to him as the Polish army had been defeated. It was a depressing time for us, for a young person. German soldiers came very often to our house, questioning us with their guns, pointing at us and searching for him in the attic, on the roof, everywhere. We were taunted with the soldiers yelling at us and their dogs. The Germans treated Poland as a colony and the Poles as slaves, their workers. The western areas of Poland, where many ethnic Germans lived, which Germany lost in the Treaty of Versailles, was annexed by the Germans. They wanted to get rid of all the Poles and give the land to Germans, expanding Germany. They changed all the names of roads, schools, stores, Germanized everything. We were second-class citizens. The Germans had first choice in the grocery stores, and we were only allowed to go into stores at a specified time. All Polish schools and libraries were closed. Churches were closed and converted to warehouses. We were not allowed our religious holidays. The intelligentsia were rounded up and killed. Catholic clergy, teachers, professors. Loudspeakers on the street glorified the Reich and Hitler. We had no rights. The Germans wanted all individuals who were healthy to work in Germany. Before the war, many Poles went to Germany for work, for seasonal work and agriculture. But in the spring of 1939, the Polish government stopped the emigration to Germany of these workers. So, when the Germans came in September 1939, one of the things they really wanted was Polish workers. So the labor officers arrived, seemingly with the army, and many, many of us became forced labor for the Third Reich. Many people, like my family, had fled and then returned home. But there was little food and no work as the Germans moved in and took all good jobs. In 1940, everyone age 16 was supposed to register with the labor office, and they were given identification. No Pole wanted to work for the Germans at this point, but some went willingly, as there was no food or money for anything. You know, even by October 1939, the Germans were expelling thousands of Polish families out of Western Poland, Jews and non-Jews, to concentration camps and to forced labor. By the end of 1939, over 100,000 Poles had been deported out of Poland for forced labor. You see, the German factories and farms would tell the labor officers how many people they needed. They would then send out a summons for Poles to appear at the labor office. Of course, they wanted as many of us as they could organize. There were many labor offices. Nowadays, we hear about concentration camps, but not much about the forced labor. My brother was taken early in 1940 into forced labor. We all did everything to try and avoid the summons, keeping a low profile. We would hide, but the fifth column would spy on the Poles and relay information back. One night, 2 soldiers arrived. We didn't see them coming, and they handed my sister and me the summons. Both of us were to report that week. I was 17 and she was 18. We knew it meant deportation. We cried. If you did not show up on the day specified, there would be repercussions for your family. They would be shot or sent to a camp. It was 1941. We went to the labor office with our mother, who had to wait outside. We had to go into the office and see an officer individually. He asked a couple of questions, and then we were given a letter in German that said we had to report to a doctor at such and such a time. The next day, we went to see the doctor. There were many others there, and lots of mothers waiting outside, some with children in hand waiting. We went in one at a time. The doctor didn't examine me. He just gave me another letter and sent me out a different door. It was an assembly line. My mother cried when she read it. Both my sister and I had to report 5 days later. We would be transported to Germany. If we did not, the whole family would be deported or killed. We all cried. My father was gone. We didn't know where my oldest brother was, and the other brother was already in forced labor. It was a very sad time. 2 SS showed up at the house and told us we had 10 minutes to pack our things and get out because they decided to come get us a day earlier. Mother gave us bread as she hadn't prepared more food for us yet, and we each took a small suitcase with a couple of sweaters, skirts, and we wore our coats and boots. It was very emotional. They herded us onto a train, and we went like cattle to Germany. My sister and I went to a factory in Berlin. Upon arrival, we all had to strip in front of the soldiers and take a cold shower. They fumigated our clothes and made fun of us. It was very humiliating. We had never been treated so poorly. We were nothing to them. And it didn't make sense, as the barracks we ended up in were not clean. The living conditions were very poor. 25 of us in cots with straw mattresses, coal stove in the middle of the room. We were given 1 blanket. I used my coat as an extra blanket and sometimes slept in my clothes when it was cold. The Germans wanted us to write home to ask for extra clothing to be sent because they didn't want to give us any. Of course, there was not much at home either. The first thing was that we had to wear the letter P, so everyone knew we were Polish. We had to sew it to our lapel and wear it at all times. We worked very hard. We were sewing. It was an assembly line. We were up at 4 a.m., walked to work from the barracks to begin before 6 a.m., supervisors at the front and back with dogs. I'm still afraid of large dogs. We usually were given a piece of bread and a coffee at the factory, although sometimes they ran out. All our letters were censored, of course, as were our mother's, and any packages coming back to us were searched. Also, once we acclimatized, we learned German to sound like a German citizen, which wasn't difficult for me. I've always had a good ear. We would travel into Berlin. We would remove the pee from our clothes so that we could travel by public transport, go to church, and move freely. I remember seeing thousands of young people in the street from different countries: Czech, French, Slovaks, Dutch. Also, on one Sunday, my sister and I built a little shelf with a piece of wood. We put up a picture of the Madonna, and like many Poles, venerated the Black Madonna of Częstochowa. She was our savior. She taught us to be stoic. I still find strength in her. One of the factory supervisors would routinely pick a girl, and she would have to live with him for a while, and then another. I heard that in other cases, supervisors would come into the barracks and make the girls dance. It did not happen to me, but I was afraid it would. It was not a crime for a German man to violate a Polish woman, although he may lose some prestige or be removed of some responsibilities. We were second-class citizens, or nothing to them. If the man was younger, then the Polish woman would be sent to a concentration camp, as she was corrupting a German youth. But if a German woman went with a Polish man, she was punished by having her head shorn in public. The man would be executed. Our factory hours became longer, and food was in greater demand, so we were always hungry and tired. When the air raids occurred, the Germans had bomb shelters, but we were in our barracks or at the factory working. Most factories were near the rail lines, which the Allied forces were targeting. At night, the air raid signals kept us awake as much as the bombing. I am still terrified of loud noises and thunder because of that time. After the war, my mother insisted that I not return, as life was terrible in Poland. Poland was much worse off. I was classified as a displaced person and sent for a 6-week training course to be a nurse's aide. Afterwards, I was stationed in Naples in order to board a refugee ship for displaced persons headed to South America and New York City. I was working as a nurse's aide on the ship. I completed 2 world tours. It was exhilarating after being in the factory for 5 years. Finally, we were free. There were some stormy days, but we made it through. I met my future husband on board. He was an English naval officer who was in charge of the refugees on board. We met in June, and within 9 months were married at a civil ceremony in Naples. Funny story. I had to room with my husband's ex-girlfriend for 6 months while he did his last sojourn to Australia and finished his naval work. Then he immigrated to Canada first, and when I finally received my papers, I joined him. We went to Montreal. He got a job with the newspaper and went to university at night. I kept the apartment, and we had 3 children. He received his PhD after 7 years, and then we moved here to this house in the early 60s, before our last son was born. My oldest brother died in a concentration camp. My father returned. My parents visited us here numerous times over the years. The money we sent them made it easier for them in Poland, and things eventually improved. Germany offered the people of Silesia free education, language training, and job training in Germany. Some of my relatives moved to Germany. I would have remained in Poland probably all my life, not seen the world, and never have learnt the skills I now have with languages. I speak 8 languages. Nor would I have met my husband or come to Canada. Poland was devastated during the war. 1/5 of its population was lost. 6 million died. This area we live in, the landscape is very much like Poland, and we always appreciated the wildlife, animals, and nature. My father helped build the shed over there. We always did things ourselves. No regrets. I did what I had to do. War is terrible. I lost my teenage years to it, and so many families were torn apart. Do what you want to do, and do what you feel is right, and not what someone tells you to do.
That was Zosia's story. Jane Heyman was the voice of Zosia. On the next episode of Invisible Women, I'll discuss embodiment. Embodiment, that's what's coming up on the next episode. Please visit us on the web where you'll find additional information and resources, and subscribe to the newsletter. You can do that on the website at www.invisiblewomen.ca. This podcast is produced by Robert Ouimet. I'm Diane Gregg. Thanks for listening.